As this meeting is being recorded. So thank you, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for attending today. I'm really pleased to see that we have people from a bunch of different sectors here for this. And I wanted to start off just by saying, well, why are we having a forest panel for today's Climate Action Network? Because we are in the throes of our agriculture and food climate action release push. But the reason why this is important, it's important to all sectors, is in our climate action plan work, what we found, the bar none, that forests and the health of forests is the single most cross-cutting action that we can take. Protecting our forests is relevant to every single sector. So it's relevant to all of us, from the perspective of creating additional income for farmers and for foresters from producing firewood or timber or whatever other sort of additional values they have, for tourism on our island, our very unique coastal Douglas fir ecosystem area that we're in, this zone is very unique biodiversity. It's very important. The other thing that we found is there's values in our forests in protecting us from climate change, because the forests are acting like sponges. They're helping to reduce drought. They create shade and moderate temperature. They can also help to reduce the spread of fire. The other thing that we found in our climate action plan is that forests are very important on Salt Spring in helping us to meet our emissions reduction targets. So for Salt Spring in 2018, one of the things that we found is that the second largest source of emissions from carbon sources on island was from land clearing. And that was second only to transportation. So those are, the loss of forest and the clearing of land is really significant here. But at the same time, there's a bunch of different values that we need to be thinking about. How can we manage our forests in light of climate change, but also how can we manage the forests for the multiple values, for creating local jobs, for protecting biodiversity, to producing the local firewood that we need on island. And so today's panel is going to allow us to hear from a selection of very experienced practitioners who have been managing forests sustainably or interested in fire risk reduction, and have very extensive and concrete examples to share with us about how they have successfully managed for multiple values. And so to set the context for us today, I'd like to introduce Erik Piikkila. Erik is going to help to set the context about climate change, sustainable forestry, and really how we need to be thinking about our forests going forward, because the way that we have in the last 100 years been managing our land and managing the forest has actually created risks for our communities. And we're in a need to do things different going forwards. And also, given that climate change, the rate of extreme weather events, the severity of them is increasing with every decade, we really need to be making changes now. So I'm very pleased to introduce Erik Piikkila. Erik is a third generation forest family from Vancouver Island. He's had extensive experience hands-on working in forest management. He's been employed with the welfare and employment insurance forestry crews in the past in British Columbia. He's done a lot of work in the woods, including second growth falling, chokerman, skidder driver, tree spacer, pruner planter, silviculture surveyor, a lot of hands-on experience. He works a lot with foresters. He's got forestry studies from BCIT. He's been employed by the BC Ministry of Forests, has a Bachelor of Forestry from Finland. And so he's got experience working in a whole bunch of different geographies, including the Pacific Northwest, to draw from, and has worked also with First Nations communities. He's also worked at University of Washington under the father of ecosystem-based management and ecological forestry, Jerry Franklin. So I'm very pleased to introduce Erik to help set the context for our panel today. Welcome, Erik.
Let's see here. Thank you, Ruth. That was a very nice introduction. Yeah, I'm standing on the shoulders of some giants like Jerry Franklin, and my dad and my grandpa were both tree fallers, you know, starting in the 1920s, and my dad in the 1960s. So I've got, you know, standing on their shoulders and all the tough work they kind of did too. I wanted to be one of them, but they said nope. They'd be, you know, tree fallers get killed every year, so you should go use your brain. So that's what I'm trying to do. That's my hope anyway. But what I would suggest is that there's a really neat graphic out there that sort of three big waves. And the smallest wave actually is, say, the pandemic. And behind that is a higher wave that talks about ecosystems and species collapse as a bigger wave coming in at us. And then the highest wave in behind that is climate change and global warming. So we have a lot of huge challenges that are coming at us really fast and are going to really probably put the thumb screws on us, whether we like it or not. But I think that we're at such an important point that we've got at least 50 years of Western ecological science to be building on. We're tapping into trying to rediscover 14,000 years of traditional ecological knowledge, First Nations traditional ecological knowledge as well, and see where those two, Western science and traditional ecological knowledge, link together. And to help us understand these ecosystems and how we've changed them over the last 160 years since colonial times and settler times, and what have we done that, you know, literally in probably in less than 100 years, we've gone from 100% old growth in a lot of cases down to now less than 10%, 20%, or down to less than 1% in old growth condition in the coastal Douglas fir ecosystem. So we've done a lot of things, and we really need to find all kinds of data sources to figure out what have we done to these landscapes and understand what kind of condition they're in now. Can we restore them? How do we restore them? And what is it that we can do to move these sort of three main avenues of ecology and social and economic possibilities forward at the same time while we're looking at, after, or restoring these ecosystems. I see these ecosystems as like a big golden egg that on its own would produce a good variety of ecological goods and services, such as storing carbon, storing and filtering water, providing habitat, providing you know, shade and cooling for the planet, and non-timber forest products, you know, mushrooms and all types of things out there. And these ecosystems do these things for free, and important wetlands out there as well, storing carbon, filtering water, slowing water down. So these ecosystems naturally will slow water down as it heads from the mountaintops all the way down to the ocean. But a lot of our systems and our urban infrastructure is meant to move that water out of there as fast as we can and down from the mountaintops and into the ocean within hours, whereas in the past in old growth forest, maybe that takes months or an entire year or even years, or maybe never even makes it to the ocean because it's been put into the soil and down into the underground aquifers. So that's some of the starting point I want to talk about, is that I think that these ecosystems are an ecological bank account that grow so much every year, and that's an interest in that ecological bank account. But for many years, we've been taking away the interest and cutting into the principal, if not the entire principal of that bank account. So if the bank account isn't being replenished, then we're going to keep taking out more and more and more and more. So, and as we've seen to do things in BC, is that we kind of run forestry like a well, we run it like a bank account, but we don't really know what's going into the bank account, and we don't really have a good handle of what's coming out of our bank accounts. Our personal bank accounts, we get a statement, so we know exactly what's happening in our bank account, and we aren't as precise, I don't think, in forestry in BC in that way. And I think there's a huge opportunity there to get data, create data, share data, so that we all have a good data set to work from to figure out what have we done to these ecosystems, how are they growing, and what are they producing in the way of ecological goods and services, these natural assets that many municipalities are now starting to manage for. So what I would say is that this whole effort, I think, too, and what we need to do in BC is to create opportunities for these, for the ecological, for the social, and for the economic possibilities. And also not to just do single treatments in the forest, but to think about and use multiple objectives that say if you were to do thinning for fire smarting, because that's one of our bigger issues with climate change, the forests are drying out, summer droughts and those types of things. So if we had a thinning regime that then addressed the fire issues, fire smarted, but then also helped that forest move along the old growth development curve, created some habitat, enhanced its water storage capabilities or water filtration or putting water into aquifer abilities, created some habitat, and shaded out to cool down streams. So we've got some salmon habitat and the wide variety of ecological goods and services that we expect. Store carbon, give us some fresh water that these ecosystems provide. Well, if by doing that multiple objective thinning, you're also then in the end going to create some timber supply, which then creates jobs and creates local economic possibilities as well. So that's one of the examples, but then maybe sort of a thinning regime may not work for everybody. So we want to have a wide spectrum of opportunities and possibilities and solutions. Maybe somebody just wants to let their forest grow and store carbon or create water or have fish habitat or a nice riparian forest for fish and keeping the water cool in the streams. So wide range of opportunities and possibilities and solutions with multiple objectives that we can hit all of those main kind of categories and move everybody along together, float many boats, as opposed to being stick-like and punitive and making people super regulatory that makes people not want to participate. I also see this as an opportunity of education. Like we've kind of let forestry education or forestry extension go away, whereas we can help landowners with information and education on how to apply these different techniques and systems and methods on their landscapes depending on their objectives. And that's what I think as well too. This is about engaging all people in all groups and trying to move things forward and helping them manage the lands in the way they want to manage them, and do that so we have multiple benefits for everybody. And in particular, we want to be able to make sure that these ecosystems are firing on all cylinders and looking after us, because if we don't look after that golden goose egg, which is our ecosystems and planet Earth, well, then our existence is going to become even much more difficult on this planet. So kind of in a nutshell, is what I would like to do is sort of work in the forest watershed ecology side of things, and forestry side and agroforestry possibilities, and restorative agriculture, permaculture. And there's just so much knowledge out there that we need to be drawing on, that we can help put things right and fix things up. Let alone, I mean, this is purely me talking from a Western, colonialist kind of point of view, but we also need to be making it better for everybody, and especially First Nations, that we have all the ecological goods and services that First Nations are needing as well, and their cultural and spiritual and ecological needs are being met and not being stomped on by colonial processes and colonial thinking. So that's a big, huge task, but if we approach this all with open minds and work together, collaborate together, and help everybody lift many boats up at the same time, I think we can achieve a whole bunch of things, least of all restoring our ecosystem so they can help us survive into the future, and we can help them making sure that they're going to survive and provide habitat for a wide variety of species, and at the very least store some carbon, provide some from fresh water, and help fight climate change with this incredible jewel of ecosystems that we have here on coastal BC. So I think I'd like to stop there, and I didn't use up all the 15 minutes because there's so many other people that have lots of neat stuff to talk about, and we need to move to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. So I think the context you said is there's a lot of different values in our forested ecosystems for different people in our communities. And it seems like a big task to try to address all of these things. Often they seem like they're in conflict with each other. So how do we have firewood while we're also protecting our forests? We can thin, but how do we do that? And it doesn't make sense. And what exactly does it look like to do this? So I'd like to move now to the panel where we're going to hear from from people with forest management, forest ecology, and forestry experience, lots of experience over decades, and hear how they have meshed these values together, the types of lessons that they've been learning over the past 2 or 3 decades in managing their forests under the changing weather and changing climate conditions. So in our area, what we're specifically looking at is increasing summer drought. So there's issues of water and drought. There's issues of heat. We have these heavy winter rainfall events. And we also have a historic legacy of land management practices that have left behind fuel loads and actually created conditions on our island that have made us more vulnerable to some of the impacts from climate change. So to start off with, I think what's an important perspective is to start understanding the lay of the land on Salt Spring. So where are we? What does the situation look like here on Salt Spring in terms of our risks from climate change and the things that we should be concerned about, and how should we be thinking about them? So to start off with, I'd like to welcome Captain Mitchell Sherrin from our local Salt Spring Island Fire Rescue. Mitchell, I think, is very familiar to many people here. He's been teaching students about wildfire prevention for over 16 years. He's an active firefighter locally, and he is very heavily involved in understanding forest stewardship and fire risk mitigation and hazards for Salt Spring Island. He's also served on deployments to other parts of British Columbia, like Williams Lake and Burns Lake. So these are extremely large scale fires, very different from what we expect to see on a place like Salt Spring. And he's actively hoping and working to enhance fire smart initiatives on Salt Spring right now in light of climate change. And one of the things that he's done for homeowners is to help develop a residential sprinkler protection unit, and also training firefighters in wildland fire suppression. So the other thing that's going on in the community, Mitchell, I think people would be interested in hearing about, is the Community Wildfire Resilience Protection Plan that you're working on. And also, I want to make you more of a human being, as you shared with me that you're an avid hiker and that you love kayaking and you love the ecosystems in our area. And so to start off with, for you, what I would be interested is, what are you working on? What do you see as priorities in our community? And what are the vulnerabilities that you really would like what are the values you see that we need to be addressing on the island as priorities?
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, as you touched on, we've probably all noticed the changes in the summer weather with the increased drought and heat in the summers. And maybe many of you have noticed we had a much drier spring, which of course increases things as far as fire hazard quite a bit as well. In fact, this year, I saw something I hadn't seen before. When we start getting fire weather, we have a weather station at the fire hall in Fulford that is monitored by the Ministry of Forests. And they give us a different kind of weather forecast than most people get. It includes things like the duff moisture content and the fine fuel moisture content. And from all of those values, it creates a numerical value that then translate into whether or not we have a low, moderate, high, or extreme fire hazard rating. And the first day that the meteorologists started the season for us, we came out of the gates in high in spring back in April. And I haven't seen that before. Like, that was new, right in April, to start the season already with a high fire risk. And people might look around and think everything's green, but the forest is still remarkably dry. We had nowhere near the kind of moisture that we normally have in both the winter and in the spring. And if you recall, heading back to a fire like Fort McMurray, that was actually a spring fire caused or starting in an area that had suffered a dry spring. So that causes concern. And then another element, you mentioned the legacy forestry practices leaving a large fuel load. Another one that causes a lot of concern for me is the increased winter storms. And everybody's going to remember the great winter storm of December 2018 left dead trees everywhere all over the ground. But, you know, since then, you might have noticed, and I certainly do, hiking around on the trails on Salt Spring, the winter storms of 2019 and 2020 dropped a lot of trees as well. And in a forest fire, it's actually mostly the dead stuff that burns. And if a fire, especially in our coastal Douglas fir ecosystem, if it's just confined to a very small area, the living material doesn't tend to burn. Most of the species here are quite fire resistant. But if we have a lot of dead material on the ground, you know, trees and branches that's been collecting, that's what will burn. And then if that gets going hot enough, it will ignite the living trees. So that is equally concerning to me. So those are pretty bad. And then on top of that, a lot of people have probably noticed the stressed species. Cedars have been taking a brutal time for the last few years, and I'm really concerned about the future of cedars in our area. Salal took a real beating a couple of years ago. 2019, 2020 had been okay, but a lot of people might have noticed the Salal had a really tough time. And if we have some extreme winters, dry springs, droughts in the summers, if we lose the Salal is an incredibly fire-resistant species. If those die, they're going to become part of the fuel load, and we lose that protection that they offer us as well. They end up getting replaced by invasive species like fire-loving broom and gorse. Gorse and broom are both called pyrophoric. They love fire. It helps them spread and grow. So on the good side of fire, Gary oak also likes fire. So if you like a good Gary oak meadow, those could be, we could have more of those in our future. So there's a positive takeaway. So yes, I have concerns shared by most of the people in this panel. But then to go back one step, we have to recognize that fire is a natural part of all forest ecosystems. And I want to repeat that. If you live in a forest environment, a forest environment is a fire environment. It's just a natural cycle that comes through. So then us as firefighters, we recognize that, and there are times when now the Ministry of Forests is saying, okay, this fire is in a place where the best thing to do is to just let it go. But when it's close to human settlements, of course, that's not going to work. And that's really the case for anywhere on Salt Spring. We can't let a fire get out of control. So our priorities are towards increasing awareness and understanding and action towards these ideas of fire smart. Now, we're quite fortunate on Salt Spring with a lot of things. As I mentioned, our ecosystem actually favors us as far as a fire-resistant environment. It's nothing like the interior BC. So I hope to put some people at ease if they're comparing us to the interior and thinking an event that might happen around the Okanagan could happen here. To give a sense of perspective again, measuring normal forest fire cycles in a ponderosa pine type forest like you might see in the Okanagan, they should anticipate a fire about every 10 years in any given area. That's just a natural part of that cycle with lightning strikes, that type of vegetation. That's just the way it should go. But on a coastal Douglas fir forest, we're looking at more like a fire cycle of 80 years. So they're much more unusual. And then on top of that, our fires tend to be quite small and localized. As a good friend of mine, Dimitri Vasis, I struggle with his last name because he's Finnish. Once the fire leaves something like a slash pile and it hits the hardcore forest, it tends to just snuff out as it encounters all the moisture of a good, healthy forest. Now, he has noted in the last couple of years, he's seen a change in behavior, which is what raises all of our concerns. But as long as our forests are healthy, they contain so much moisture that fire doesn't tend to grow very large very fast. If it does get large, it has an incredible amount of energy because there is so much fuel in our forests compared to, say, the Okanagan. But they don't tend to be, and we tend to spot them early because there's so many people around. And then our fire department responds quickly and puts them out. One thing people might not realize is we hit an average of about 17 wildfires on the island each year. And I don't have the figures from last year, but we had like 12 the year before, and we've already had a couple this year. Those are almost exclusively caused by human activity, and our leading cause of fire on Salt Spring is open burning that gets out of control. So if we could just get people to stop burning unwisely and monitor their fire and then put it out, that would get rid of a lot of our risk. But another thing we can do on top of that, really obvious no-brainer, don't let your fire go into the forest, is to create a buffer around your buildings. And so this is where FireSmart kicks in. And one thing that scientist Jack Cohen came up with back in the 60s, looking at the wildfire events in California, is that we could throw as many resources as we want at some fires, and we simply can't win. And we've seen that the last couple of years in California. But houses still survived. And he became very curious about that. And he looked at why they survived. And what he discovered was, first and foremost, if somebody has a fire-resistant roof, which is pretty much anything except cedar shake, houses tend to survive fires, like at an alarmingly high rate. So simply getting rid of all the cedar shake roofs would make a huge difference to houses surviving fire. And then another one is creating a buffer around a home, starting in concentric circles, where in the close space around your home, you're quite vigilant and really think about removing most vegetation immediately. And I'm talking like touching your building. So I did this myself a couple of years ago when I painted my house. I was really reluctant. Like I had clematis and wisteria and stuff. And it's like, I don't want to take those away. But I had to do it to paint the house anyway. And now I look at it, it's like, yeah, it looks great. And it's also apparently, according to my friend James in pest control services, I'm going to reduce my chances of rats and insects getting in too. So double win. But anyway, get things back a couple feet. Then as you go out farther and farther away from your home, you can sort of relax things a bit out to about 100 meters. And what you're doing is really like that simple yard maintenance we learned from our grandparents. Like there's a reason why our ancestors picked up the sticks around our home. Those are the things that will burn. If we pick up all those sticks and get them away from the house, we're less likely to have a forest fire. Mowing the lawn. Again, grass doesn't burn like super hot, but it burns really fast. And it's like a fuse leading to your house. So keep your grass mowed really short and or water it. I know we've got water issues here on Salt Spring, but a green short lawn is like a moisture bubble around your home that'll help protect it from fire. So these ideas of FireSmart, thinning the forests so you don't have the conifers all intermeshed, pruning only up to about 6 feet is enough for fire protective measures, and then consider replacing species, or when you're planting a garden, thinking about things that are fire resistant as opposed to pyrophoric. You don't want to plant a lot of broom around your house. Similarly, juniper and cedar and fir and spruce, these are pretty volatile species, and it's best not to have them right next to your house. I have a really big cedar tree within 10 meters of my house. I'm not going to chop it down. It's a beautiful tree. I love it. But I consider the area around that tree, and I have it well mowed and protected. So I don't want that tree to catch fire, because if that tree catches fire, it's going to put risk to my house. Sort of having this fire risk mindset. And it can be a hazard reduction model. It doesn't have to be a moonscape. So this is the kind of stuff that we're working on. And then on top of that, talking to foresters like the panel here about keeping healthy forests, because healthy forests are way less likely to burn. So those are my priorities. And I hope I haven't run too long. Maybe I should stop here. We'll talk about other stuff later.
Thank you, Mitchell. Actually, that's great, because the next thing that what you've introduced is the importance of a healthy forest. And you've been talking about individual homes, and often have modified areas, and people put different species of plants and wood chip walkways and so forth. And I think really this begs the next question is, what is a healthy forest, and how do we have healthy forests? How do we keep forests and our trees healthy so that they're protecting us from fire? And we have someone with a lot of experience who can talk to explain this to us, and also to share with us some of the practices that he's been using for decades, for 34 years as the steward of 7 Ravens Ecoforest, Michael Nichols. And Michael is very passionate about forest health. And so this is really important for us to understand, what does a healthy forest look like, particularly given that we know that weather is changing and that we have this legacy of historic factors that have changed the conditions that we're dealing with. And then also what I heard Mitchell say is, you know, it raises questions, Michael, like what's going on with our forests? We're seeing things happen to species, and what do we do about it? And what makes soils healthy? And I know that you have a lot of experience with the roles of increasing biodiversity on soil health, mycorrhiza, the importance of them and the overall production of a functional system. And so I'd love to hear from you on that. And also the thing that you're most proud of, which I think is really great and gets back to Erik's point, the knowledge and the skills that we need are in people, in these practitioners, and there's no one better we can learn from than people who've been practicing sustainable forestry and ecosystem-based forestry. Michael has been very involved in training and education of the public like us here today, including youth in educational programs. And they run a school on permaculture and ecoforestry now for a long time, and which has trained hundreds of youth through this process. And a lot of these young people have gone on to ecoforestry careers across Canada and other parts of the world. And in fact, Michael has traveled as a teacher over 35 years to every continent, teaching permaculture and ecoforestry from particularly school children, kindergarten to 12, in East and Southern Africa. So we have a person with a lot of perspective here, but he lives on Salt Spring and his practice is on Salt Spring. And thank you, Michael. We really look forward to understanding a bit more about our forests from you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Good evening, everyone. I've got headphones on. I've never done this before, so I'm sort of in a strange bubble right now, but I'll try my best. There's a lot of great comments from Erik and also from Mitchell about forests and incredible perspectives. A healthy forest, what does it look like? Basically, I think a healthy forest is 7 generations of trees, so or more, if possible. And so we're talking about 1,000-year-old trees all the way down to, you know, 1 or 2 year old trees. And for that to happen is very much what would happen in a natural forest, where a big giant falls down, opens up a lot of light. In that light, then all the new seeds drop in, and then you get new growth coming. And so then you get the first generations happening right beside the 7th generation, the 1,000-year-old trees. So age classifications is very important. If you were starting with a bare field, I would suggest that we just mimic nature, because in nature, what would happen is in a landslide, alder would move in right away. So by planting tons of alder or just casting seeds in a barren landscape, the alder would come up and then other species would follow on there. And we can do that by planting the alders, following with fir and cedar and whatever else we want to put into that forest to give us our mix. And then as the trees are growing, then we can start thinning the trees and then laying them down on contour to gather up the soil moisture and create better mycorrhizal connections, moisture holding capacity of the soil. So that's how you would start from scratch. If you have anything in between an old growth and a bare field, every single place is going to be slightly different, but you're working with what's there. And what I've seen a lot on Salt Spring is places that had been clear cut in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, where all of a sudden nothing is left behind. And then you get thousands of Douglas fir, or in some cases, you know, if you're on the north side, hemlock or cedar, but you get a lot of monoculture and you get a very, very thick forest. These are the dangerous forests that we're talking about. These are the forests that are likely to catch fire, that Mitchell is concerned about, that we all should be concerned about. So those forests need to be thinned. They need to be limbed and thinned, and then all the material, instead of taking it out and burning it somewhere, leave it in the forest and put it on contour in bands that are 1 meter wide, and you know, they can be hundreds of meters long, and then break it down so that it then starts to build soil. Use canola oil in your chainsaw. If there can be some mycelium in with that, that's even better. The right type of mycelium. I'm working on that. I haven't come up with that yet, but anyway, that's then you've got a wall. The water's coming down the hill. It hits that wall. It penetrates deeper into the forest, creating more mycorrhizal connection between the trees, which improves the tree health of all the forest, increases species, creates habitat for the mice, the squirrels, the rats, the salamanders, the newts, whatever is in the forest. They all can join in that area. They spread out life throughout the forest. So you've got moisture retention is one of the most important things. And that's what Erik was mentioning in the beginning. And I think that's what we all have to think about, is how do we gain as much moisture when the moisture is falling to be staying in the forest and penetrating deep into the ground, so that it can benefit the forest throughout the summer when it's most needed. Thinning and spacing and pruning will also help increase forest biodiversity on the floor. With salal, like Mitchell was mentioning, the more stages we have in our forest, the more that we have the top canopy, then we have the medium-sized trees and the lower trees and the bushes, then the salal, then the creeping, what are they called, the trailing black-capped raspberries, all of that stuff. The more that there is in the forest, the more moisture is being helped or maintained, the better the forest is growing, the less likely it is to burn. If we have lots of dead branches right down to the ground, those are ladders where the fire is going to climb. We're going to get forest fires. So I've been lucky enough to have this forest for 35 years that I've been able to manage. In that time, I calculated it the other day again after we talked. I've removed about between 70 and 90 truckloads of logs, but you can't tell that a single tree has been cut here. I mean, you can see the odd stump, but the volume of the forest has grown exponentially. I think that it was Erik who mentioned it the other day, looking up the Lubeck model, which I did. And it's exactly what I've been doing here. It's what Merv Wilkinson was doing. It's the kind of practice that we should be thinking about doing as property owners on Salt Spring, is figuring out a way to take out what needs to be taken out, make some value out of it, and then replenish it with either more light that new things can grow, or plant. And planting inside a forest is an incredibly difficult thing to do. I started on day one when I bought this land, and it took me many, many, many years to actually have success in getting plants to take. If you're planting in a really dry site, you have to dig an incredibly deep hole. You have to take out all the rocks. You have to go way down. And then you have to plant the most drought tolerant species you can find, and then do a big rock mulch. I learned that in Africa, was using rocks as a mulch, because rocks in the summer heat, they become warm at the surface and then they're cool at the bottom. So they tend to recirculate the moisture through condensation. And that's been incredibly effective. But if you're planting in the middle of the forest where it's really dark and shady, you know, the species we would have chosen in the past would have been cedar, but cedars are probably not such a good species to be planting anymore. I think the right place for cedar are along the rivers, in very wet areas where there's springs. There are many, many good places for planting cedars, and we should not give up on cedars, because it's an incredible tree, beautiful tree. It's a tree of life for First Nations. And we should definitely continue that tree, but we have to be more selective as to where we plant it. If we're planting it just willy-nilly all over the place on the farm, it's going to have varying degrees of success, but in the drier areas, it will definitely fail in the hotter, drier weather. California redwood, the coastal redwood, is so far the best species I've come across for underplanting as a coniferous species in the forest. We can use vine maple, they're very shade tolerant. Big leaf maple is very shade tolerant. They're beautiful trees. They grow quickly.
So Michael, if I'm hearing you right, then what you're saying, which sort of, I want to relate it back to Mitchell's point about Fire Smart, is we actually need to be coming up with site-specific strategies that recognize the features of a place. So this is a great. I'm going to ask you to bring this back when we have our discussion about things that we might want to actually employ on Salt Spring, because I think that's a really important piece, is how do we balance this tendency to, like, we want to make it not too complicated for people to think about Fire Smart, but we also have to somehow recognize that there isn't one rule for everything. So thank you very much. That's very important information, I think, for our discussion today.
Okay. Yeah, no, site specific is super important.
Yeah, no, that's thank you. And so to continue on the flow with this, and because we want to get to the discussion where we actually brainstorm and we hear from the practitioners about what it is that we should be thinking about doing, what we can employ to achieve multiple values on Salt Spring. I'm going to move to Mark Lombard. Mark is a forester with the ecological forester with the Cortes Community Forest. He comes from a family that he describes as having a background in light touch logging and sawmilling. And him and his brother are 6th generation loggers working with lot from Nova Scotia. Mark has studied biology at Acadia University in the 90s, and then went on to public and environmental policy at SFU from 2004 and 2006. Since 2013, Mark has been at the community forest on Cortes Island, which I think we have a lot to learn from, and putting these ideas of multiple values and sustainable forestry in practice in the Salish Sea. So we have a lot, there's gonna be a lot of questions for you, Mark. What's interesting there is this is a licensee management of public forest lands through the Cortes Forestry General Partnership. And so this is, I'm gonna ask Mark to tell us a little bit about how do you do this? How do you make something like this happen? Now we need to deal with fire, we need to deal with climate change, we need to be locally identifying the right features and qualities for healthy forest production, and you're doing it. So this is what we want to hear from you on today. And also, I think I would just mention that your comment about the thing that you're most proud of is that the last harvest you completed in the community forest was a single stem selection thinning using all local contractors and all the saw logs, which is 16 loads, that went to Cortes Island Mills. So this is about jobs and local community resilience, building resilience. And you say it was expensive and complicated, but the success and community approval was rewarding. And I'm also grateful to have built 2 lovely natural passive net zero homes for a family in Courtenay and one in Cortes Island in the past 5 years. So now I want to move on to like putting things in practice, and what are we talking about with multiple values? Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Ruth. And thanks everyone for joining tonight. It's really exciting hearing from Erik and Michael and Mitchell. I was really excited after our plenary a couple of weeks ago, and I told a bunch of the people I'm working with. I'll start out just a little bit of a background. The Cortes Forestry General Partnership is the licensee that holds the community forest license on the Crown land on Cortes. It's about 3,800 hectares, and we were awarded the license in 2013 after about 25 years of trying to get a community forest license. And it's a 50-50 partnership between the Klahoose First Nation, whose traditional territory Cortes Island is in, unceded territory, and the Cortes Community Forest Cooperative, which is an organization that was formed to represent the non-native population on Cortes and has a membership of about 25% of the island's population. So it doesn't represent everybody on the island, but it's you know, for a small island, it's a pretty good membership. So when we got the license in 2013, the first thing that we did was we embarked on a community-based planning process to sort of identify the high-level values of the community of Cortes and what they would like to see in our forestry operations. And as you can probably imagine, there was a pretty high degree of preference towards conservation, less of an emphasis on profit, and more of an emphasis on local value added and building the local industry, which is still a tall feat because we haven't had much of a forest sector on Cortes for, you know, 2 or 3 decades. There's been a couple of logging projects that have happened over the last, you know, 20 or 30 years, but they've been kind of one-off where a contractor comes from somewhere else and they, you know, clear cut 80 acres and then they're gone. So there isn't really much of an industry on the island. So as Ruth said in the introduction, our project that we did last year, we logged 1,000 cubic meters and 650 meters went to local mills. And I designed the project specifically in an area that we had built a road into to access. And I designed it specifically to meet the demand for 6 loads of hemlock and 5 loads of Douglas fir and 5 loads of cedar. So it was a really interesting challenge to try to design a thinning project on the land base that would accommodate exactly that demand. And it's interesting too. I think I should clarify a little bit, like, you know, people have talked a lot about thinning, and I think thinning means slightly different things in different situations. You know, like what I'm talking about here is like a commercial thinning. So we're going out into the forest, we're actually cutting a lot of the co-dominant trees. We always leave the biggest, nicest tree in any one area, but we took out the understory mistletoe diseased hemlock, which is, you know, dying and falling over. Could be considered unhealthy forest in some ways, but it's really interesting talking about the healthy versus unhealthy forest, because some people say that adds a lot of biodiversity as the trees fall over and die. Anyway, so our thinning was, we took out the diseased understory mistletoe hemlock, and then we took out the co-dominant desirable stems, or some of them that were the demand for the local mills. And we left, for the people in the crowd who are foresters, they'll understand this, we left 55 meters of basal area per hectare in retention. So we took out about 25 to 30% of the volume in the area, and we left about 65 to 70% of the volume, 75% of the volume. But it was really expensive to do. And, you know, forestry is kind of like a race to the bottom, lowest cost, you know, production, everything's expensive. The falling's expensive, the yarding is expensive, the trucking is expensive, the road building is expensive. Although right now lumber prices are through the roof if anybody's bought plywood lately, and log prices are actually doing quite well too. So that's really good for us. We made a little bit of money on the project. It was the harvest that we did for the year last year. the interesting thing is that we didn't make enough money to pay for our annual operating costs and for the road that we built. We paid for the road or the annual operating costs, but not the road. So it's an interesting thing, this whole idea of thinning. One of the things that we're working really hard on is trying to get some money for fuel mitigation for wildfire protection and thinning. And that's a big thing, you know, and I'm really curious in the discussion, maybe I'll ask Michael how large his property is or how many acres or hectares he's working on. But, you know, the Cortes Community Forest is, as I said, it's 3,800 hectares, and a lot of the area is not accessible whatsoever. You know, so for us to go and say we want to do a fuel modification or a treatment somewhere, we have to build a road to get there. And that's a complicated thing in Cortes because we don't have access to all the places. Some of it goes through private land or through the Clues First Nation or through a park or whatever. And then once you've built the road, then you've got to be able to pay for it. So you're not only going to be able to do the limbing or taking out the dead trees, you're going to have to take some of the, you know, the co-dominant or the profitable trees to make the operation pay for itself. So it's the whole balance of things to try to figure out. And you know, Cortes has a lot of biologists and a lot of environmental people on Cortes as trees, where the woodpeckers are. And Paul Stamets, for those of you who are mycologists or at least interested like I am, he says that they've identified 400 different kinds of mycelium that live in a Douglas fir tree. 200 of them live after it dies. So 200 in all of the needles and all the branches and all the leaves and all of the roots. But then after they die, through its dying process, which could take another 500 or 600 years by the time it's totally gone and not a nurse tree anymore, there's all these other kinds of mycelium and all the trees that nest in them in the hollows and stuff like that. So it's a very interesting conversation that's come up about the forest health and how do you balance that? Do you take the dead trees? They're wildfire risk, but they're also habitat trees. So one of the things that the community forest on Cortes has taught me is that there's so few perfect answers or answers that are you know, one size fits all kind of thing. One of the other lessons that I've learned in the community forest is that the local mills for the local value added sector, they want the best logs. They want the nice big logs. And so one of the things that we have to do is try to wean our local mills off their addiction to the biggest butt logs and find a way to use this sort of the second and third log or the smaller trees locally. And that's not to say that selling logs off the island is a problem, because the plywood mill in Nanaimo buys a lot of our smaller fir logs, and that's a regional economic, you know, it's part of the regional economy, and people use plywood. So that's a really positive thing too. I had a couple of other notes. I can't emphasize enough how great it is that we're actually doing this with the Clues First Nation. You know, we don't have to go consult with the local First Nation. We don't have to try to build a relationship with the Clues First Nation. Like, we're doing this with the Clues First Nation. And the Cortes Forestry General Partnership is the only general partnership in the province of the 60 or so community forests there are. Most of them are limited liability companies or sort of like arm's reach corporations that sort of manage the operation for the community forest licensee. But our board is a very hands-on board and has a lot of say in the day-to-day, not necessarily the day-to-day operations, but the overall operations planning and where we log and how we log and what's going to happen. So, and one of the other interesting things is challenging is that we're, you know, coming right back to the very beginning. I put a little star with what you said, Ruth, about protecting the forest, and Erik said that, you know, the industry's been cutting the interest that our natural system has, but it's also been cutting the capital. I personally really believe that to be the case. And so our goal, and my personal goal, has been to log the least we can possibly get away with for as long as we possibly can get away with it. And so our allowable cut is 13,600 cubic meters, and we're averaging, well, we haven't cut 13,600 cubic meters yet, and we've been a licensee for 7 years. So we're under tremendous pressure from the Ministry of Forest to cut more and cut faster. And because we're a consensus board, our board is staying strong and resolute and focused on what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve and not caving into that pressure. But the downside is that it's very financially risky. You know, log prices are good right now the last couple of years. So our small projects have kind of been able to keep the pot boiling, but we're, you know, our bank account is sort of slightly in decline. So we're, it's a challenge of balancing a lot of different factors.
Wow, thank you so much, Mark. There's so much to talk about, and it'd be very interesting just to have a presentation by you that we could have a question and answer with. I think one of the things that struck me from the conversation that we had leading up to today's panel with these panelists was that there's a lot of value added, and that the reliance on the sustainability from an economic and jobs point of view is to have value-added products. And I know that Mark talked about that specifically, as did Michael and Erik. They all had examples of this. And one of the things that I want to do, just before we close this first wrap and open into the big discussion, Erik, if it's okay, I would just like to follow up with a point that Mark raised with you, which is thinning means different things. And I know, Mark, we have a very similar situation to you here on Salt Spring. There are many forests that are inaccessible and they don't have roads, and many of them are reserves, and we don't want to have roads on them. And so, Erik, I wondered if you could just take a few minutes before we go into the group panel and talk a little bit about some of the ways that that thinning can happen. Like, what is thinning? What do we mean by thinning? And how could we maybe manage to thin in these hard to access places for these different values that we've heard from all of you today? Right.
So it's quite an umbrella of options, techniques, and methods that we actually have out there. If we think more of in a harvesting sense, under the banner sort of ecological forest management or ecosystem-based management, you could have ecoforestry in there. You could have ecological forest management. One of the ones I did my thesis on was variable retention harvesting. So that's more on the side of it. I actually have a report here from the Truck Loggers magazine from 2001. Can we see it here? No, it's going to glare out. But anyway, so what I can move it there it is. So what this is a report from 2001, but about a 1955 project, which was the first commercial thinning project in BC, or sorry, on the coast here, I should say. And you know, we have a really good history in many places up and down the east coast of the island here, from the Cowichan Valley to Campbell River, I think the Chilliwack Valley and other places, and in the interior too. We've got a lot of knowledge about commercial thinning. So that's the thing, is that we want to have multiple options out there. So what does it really look like? Well, and I saw Pierre had a question there too, is that, so how can we implement a system that you know, we can reach the ground we want to, but maybe we don't have as much machine pressure on the ground. Maybe it has to be hand-based too. Maybe we have to sort of move away from feller buncher kind of stuff too. But what I would suggest is that we actually need to move to longer line harvesting systems. Back in the 70s and 80s, there used to be the orange timber jacks, which were the skidders. You put the chokers on them, pull the logs out. Well, there was also an attachment where you could have a 45-foot mini tower. So we've actually lost on the coast here. In the railroad days, we used to have these skyline systems that used to reach out, in some cases, 10,000 feet. So they only had to build railway in the bottom, and then they were daisy chaining the logs in from multiple spar trees. So that means less sort of access structures. And the US still does that. What they do is they have what's called an intermediate span or an intermediate tree. So they've actually hung a block on the side of a tree that where maybe the ground dips down and behind where they want to reach their wood from. And they hang the block on this tree so that it acts like a little mini spar tree that helps them get farther reach and helps them get away, you know, where the ground breaks and changes and those types of things. So there's possibilities there. There's even people that have written their masters on using grapple yarders. So the great big huge logging machines that we use now to haul in the logs as fast as we can, to actually use them. And how could you thin a second growth Douglas fir forest using these grapple yarders? So there's a guy around who I know could do that. There's also a logger in the interior who's trying to bring European smaller sized harvesting equipment, the tree cutters, a smart harvester as opposed to a, let's say, a less smart or not a smart harvester, the feller buncher, and then a small forwarder, which is like a little mini logging truck, which goes in the woods, and they've got, you know, fairly low ground pressure. They've got tracks that are spreading the weight around. And of course, depending on when you're doing it in the time of year too, you don't want to be chewing up soft ground and those types of things. So there's multiple avenues to be thinking about. And when we're doing this, and we've lost this sort of these skills of commercial thinning and thinning operations and tree spacing and doing these things. And what we're going to actually need to do is we're going to need to bring in the loggers, and they're really smart, and they're actually going to help us implement these systems, which are more costly to do, but can get the logs out better. Instead of us being super prescriptive, the loggers can actually help us get better results in the ground and pull those kind of things together. So it's definitely a balancing act. And I would suggest if we use these longer line systems, then we can build less road, which then saves our logging costs. Because I mean, those can be like, I don't know what, $300,000-$400,000 a kilometer. And you know, with the culverts and all the other issues associated with roads and culverts. So anyway, that's some of the ideas that just, we have to sort of learn from other places and bring it and apply it here and see what will work for us, and sort of rediscover our European roots in forestry as well, and the technology and what they've done over the intervening decades that we've sort of lost touch with them. We need to rediscover that, and our sort of historic logging past as well with these long reach kind of systems. So yeah.
Well, thank you, Erik. And I think, so what I'm getting, this very more technical maybe than everyone can follow. But having said that, I mean, I think what I'm hearing is we have a number of issues to think about for this next part of the panel. And what I've done is I've asked, we met about a week and a half ago, and I asked everyone to think about what would a sustainable forestry operation look like for Salt Spring that would help us to reduce our fuel loads on the island, that could create some local economy through value-added products, through you know, producing our own local fuels, firewoods. How could we do that? What would that look like? And what I'm hearing is we have to deal with the sites in a site-specific way. We also have to deal with it at a smaller scale. So as Mark said, there's issues of revenue generation to be considered, but there's a lot of different techniques. So what I just want to open it up, and I don't know who might want to start, but I'd be tempted to start with you, Michael, because you have been a practitioner here on Salt Spring. And Mark would be interested to know the size of your property. Can you give us some sense of you know, how do you approach this, and how might that look at the Salt Spring, at the whole island scale, given the, you know, the various conditions that exist here? And then I'll also say, sorry, that people should just ask questions. If you have questions, put them into the chat here for any of the panelists. But I think what we're looking for here is, what would this look like for Salt Spring, and draw from the experience of people here. Michael. Thanks.
What I heard Erik say, and also Mark, was the road building. And what I've done here is I've put in several roads. My forest is actually very small. I only have, the property is 40 acres. The forest might be 30 acres. But what we do is when we want to access areas that are not accessible at the moment, is instead of trying to build a road, we try to figure out, I walk the land quite a lot, flag it, and figure out how can I get from here to wherever I want to go with cutting the least amount of trees. And so then I try to do it on contour as much as possible too, so that it prevents any kind of erosion. And then I just flag a trail, and I get a backhoe in, or an excavator, a small excavator, and we may have to remove 1 or 2 trees to get maybe, you know, 500 meters, a kilometer of road in. to a certain point that we want to get to. And so then you may take out 1 or 2 prime trees in that. Often we don't take out any trees at all if we do it just the right way. And so we're able to get to where we want to go. And then I think so the road building, you know, when we build roads for very heavy commercial vehicles. And I think that sometimes what we can do is we can also have one main road in one place and then have many smaller roads going to back to that main road and then haul from that main road. I have several main roads on the land here too. And so these other smaller roads are very, very small. They're about the width of a skidder or a pickup truck. And the skidder always stays on the road. I'd like to have done this with horses, but there is nobody who does that here. So we've been doing it with skidders. We leave the skidder on the main road. I ask them to bring in long lines. So we bring in 200 feet of line, and I can reach almost most trees from that. We have done brought in some new technologies of little winches that we are able to drag logs a little bit closer so that a skidder can then choke onto that log and then bring it out. But I think what we're doing here that allows us to be able to log in the way that we're doing is it's a single person operation. It's a sole proprietorship. So I'm able then to look at every single log and say, okay, well, I could make a 6x10 beam out of there and a whole bunch of flooring and this and that. And so then I'm looking at getting the greatest amount of value out of every single log. Right. And I know that Mark will be looking at that and Erik will be looking at that too. But sometimes, you know, for Mark in particular, it might be a little bit harder because if they're bringing out, you know, several truckloads, they're not looking at, you know, an 8-foot log and how can I make the greatest amount of value out of that 8-foot section. So I think maybe bringing it down, having lots of people involved like they do on Cortes, and letting many small operators maybe bid for those logs, then that might drive the price up a little bit, and then they can get a slightly higher revenue. Mm-hmm. And you know, some of the small roads that they put in to be able to access the logs that they need to access initially, those roads in the future can maybe be scaled up a little bit if the need is there. But if it's a small road, then it's not really destructive to the landscape. And if you keep it on contour as much as possible, it may also benefit the landscape by collecting water.
So that's really interesting, your comment there, Michael, that you're looking at privately owned managed area, which gives you a lot of local knowledge and a lot of ability to understand what needs to be done and how to do it. Mark, if I could you know, go back to you, you've got a very different situation. And on Salt Spring, we have a lot of privately owned land. We don't have any active forestry or logging operations. There's just some incidental takes, largely to do with land clearing and not so much forestry operations. And I just wonder, you know, have you given some thought to like your model and what it might look like in a place like this, where we also have a lot of private land, and maybe some insights into how you got started, or what it takes, or what you need to think about to start this kind of community forest model?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. The community forest is it's on publicly owned land, provincially owned forest land in BC. And as people probably know, like most of the forest land in BC is operated by like the large forestry companies in the TFLs or the FL forest, timber forest licenses, or the forest licenses. And then I think it was the NDP 20 years ago, they did a little take back and they took some volume back from the majors and they started a new license a new licensee type called community forests, and there's also woodlots that are typically like small, one person or family operators. And the community forests, it's a tricky thing, Ruth, because there has to be unallocated volume in the timber supply area. So we're part of the Sunshine Coast timber supply area, and there just happened to be 13,600 cubic meters of unallocated timber in the timber supply area. So they have a complicated, tipsy forest model that calculates how much the sustainable yield is for the land base, and then they basically allocate 100% of the yield to be logged. That's the government's model. It's like you log 100% of the what they calculate that it can grow every year. So I'm not familiar with the situation on Salt Spring, but I suspect that there probably is not any unallocated volume in the South Coast area or unallocated crown forest land on Salt Spring. Is that correct, you guys? Do you guys know
I think that? there is some crown land still that's under forestry on Salt Spring, up around Mount Tuam for sure. But I don't think anything's happening with it.
Right.
I think that I think it is in discussion with the CRD to be transferred to First Nation title. So right. There is, so right now there are crown lands, but they're in a state of change in oversight. Oh, Gary is here. Gary, would you like to comment and share a little bit about that process with us, if you're able?
My understanding is the province has designated all of the crown land on Salt Spring, which is, I always get mixed up whether it's 1,300 hectares or acres, but all of the crown land on Salt Spring has been designated no logging. Okay. And that was just a few years ago, kind of went under the radar because that's been a longstanding community objective, but with a caveat for First Nations interests, at least some of whom are now actively negotiating treaty and land selection and all of that. So that's my understanding with regard to crown land on Salt Spring. A few years ago, it was all designated no logging, as were some parcels on Galliano and even Southeast Vancouver Island.
Okay.
So one of the questions that Gary had, this is Gary Holman, our CRD director, for those of you that may not know him. Thank you, Gary. And one of the questions that you asked, Gary, was would a managed forest have lower fire risk than a clear cut? But just the idea of managed forest. So if we would maybe not have, is there another way we can look at thinning and reducing fuel loads as an operation that could manage our forests to reduce our risk while also generating some revenue? Is that a model that could work? And what might that, and Mark, I don't know if you've thought about this at all.
Me, yeah. Well, I certainly have.
Okay.
Gary, did you want to comment on that, or do you want me to go? Well, I mean, when I grew up logging in Nova Scotia, we had a woodlot, and we had about 50 acres of forest land that we managed exactly the same way that Michael is talking about. We had skid trails and forwarders, and then we had a landing right on the main road, and so, or 3 landings on the main road. So we brought everything out with forwarders, and we brought it a long ways, like a kilometer, which people say that's not really viable around here. One of the big differences there was that the mills, all of the mills take 8-foot logs or 10-foot logs or 14-foot logs. But here on the coast, the log lengths are long. Like all the mills take 41-foot logs, or 12.5 meters or 10.5 meter logs. So it makes forwarders really challenging to work with. So, in my heart, my background and my passion is for that kind of logging. The community forest on Cortes, we have to scale it up a little bit. And if you're doing a fuel mod thinning, like a thinning where you're going out and you're chipping all of the dead wood that's on the ground, and you're limbing up to, say, 6 or 10 feet or whatever you can reach, whatever's practical, that's really expensive. I mean, I want to be really crystal clear. That does not generate any revenue. It is really expensive to it's thousands of dollars per hectare, and the community forest on Cortes is 3,800 hectares. So we simply don't have the latitude or the funding available to go and do that kind of stuff. So when we go out and do a thinning, we have to be logging as well to be able to generate some revenue to pay for the, you know, not only to pay for the other fuel modifications, but to pay for the operation, because the community forests, I mean, the community forest model in BC, it's a very specific thing. It's a licensee. There's about 60 of them in the province, and the only revenue source that they have is selling logs. Like the only revenue source, and I can speak for our community forest, we don't have any other sources of funding from government or anything. And we have a forester, we have a forest engineer, we have myself, we have, you know, rent that we have to pay to the Ministry of Forests, we have signs, we have insurance, we have a lot of business expenses, even though we keep it as lean as we possibly can. So the only way we can be viable is by selling logs. And so it's expensive, and it's pretty nuanced. But I think that the community forest model, and again, that's 3,800 hectares, some of which is not super accessible. It's super different than a person's you know, yard or acreage or something like that. And I completely agree with Mitchell. The best way to maximize the value is to be able to look at each 8-foot log and be like, okay, this is the best for a beam, or this is good for paneling, or this is just better for 2x4s, or whatever the case may be. And so if you have a property and you have some forests on it, you know, you might be able to get a logging contractor to come in, or a firewood contractor, or a mill operator to come in and, you know, do a little bit of logging or a little bit of clearing or a little bit of thinning in exchange for the wood or something like that, you know, to generate revenue and do the fuel mitigation work. I think that's kind of trickier. Maybe you're aiming for a wash, unless you have a mill.
No, that's interesting. And so I just like to say, you know, I'm happy to open this up to more questions that like from Gary. So if people could maybe put their hand up if they want to ask a question themselves, if they feel more comfortable with that than simply typing it in the chat, please do. And I'll ask Erin Ann or Darlene to help me out and let me know when when someone has their hand up. And I just want to, along this vein, this conversation with you, Mark, you're saying that it's not, you know, this sort of approach of thinning to mitigate fire risk or for carbon storage and carbon stewardship doesn't necessarily, it isn't a revenue generator. And I got a comment from Brian Young, who's saying, how about a virtual community forest with service providers grouped together to provide consistent regenerative forestry services to large landholders, conservancies, public, private, and incorporate the carbon monetary value once the price goes up. So here's a different idea, and I don't know if anyone, Erik, you've worked with a lot of different communities. Do you have some experience with more sort of eccentric type of models like this?
Well, but for example, like that Lubeck forest that Michael mentioned, Mark, yes, that mentioned that they have 5,000 hectares and they've set aside 25% of the area for no harvesting activities, but they still employ 35 people full-time in that. They also give educational tours and they're busy, and also they're getting the products right to the mill too. So what I would like to suggest is that we had a really good example in the BC interior of the Vernon log yard, which made money hand over fist. And I discussed this in the prelim too, that it had 53 different log sorts, and we had a guitar maker come in and spend $3,000 on 3 cedar logs and turned it into $60,000 worth of guitars, right? And our forestry is kind of based on grab the quick 25% instead of maximizing 100% of the value of every cubic meter we log, or even getting 500% out of each cubic meter. And that's what I think we're missing. Like, we still do a lot of, you know, hewing wood and drawing water is what we kind of do in Canada that we don't really maximize. We still cut it down and then ship it away. And that's where I think the real shame is. And then we don't drive the local economies, although Mark is showing us that we can do that by getting the logs to the mills on Cortes there too. So there's a part of it too. And I would even suggest that on Salt Spring, for example, should actually create a local log yard that then would buy the logs from the people that come there too, and create that internal market on Salt Spring and help connect people who need the wood with the supply of wood. Because right now in BC, we can't actually say and go and get, like for Mark's, like I can't say here from Ladysmith, I can't say, Mark, I want, you know, 2 great big Dougie firs and 1 big cedar log from the Cortes Forest, Community Forest. I want to bring them down here to Ladysmith. I want to buy them and bring them here. I can't do that as a taxpayer. You can't get access to the timber supply from public lands, which seems totally counterintuitive. So I think there's a really neat way that we could build local economies, and instead of raw log exporting, keep those logs in the community and driving the local community, because they say that the provincial government with its spending there's a 3-time multiplier effect. And I bet you there'd be close to somewhat similar, maybe there's even more, in having those logs drive our local economies and the BC economy, and not China's Asia economy and shipping them to Asia and then paying to ship them back again, and you know, that kind of stuff too. So I think there's a really huge opportunity. And then to Brian's point too, is that we've envisioned maybe creating local forestry cooperatives where you would have foresters and engineers and ecologists, which then maybe the landowners would, you know, a subscription service, and they would have that knowledge and tools, a tool room and those types of things. And this is, that goes back to my forestry extension, you know, that education piece that we've walked away from, because like us in the coastal Douglas fir, we're going to need to engage with the small private landowners and help them to help us save the coastal Douglas fir zone. So we need to give them all the tools we possibly can, which is knowledge and experience and harvesting and people trained up, and forestry crews and logging crews that are trained up to do these crazy and hard systems. So give them the abilities to succeed, as opposed to saying, you know, because right now they don't have the tools, people are experienced to implement something different other than maybe clear cutting. So if we give them the tools in a forestry cooperative, then maybe that's something we can move the needle in many categories in helping people go. Like, and you've got Michael there as one of that, you know, those kind of knowledge holders and experience holders on Salt Spring. But that's an idea we've sort of kicked around for Yellow Point as well, a forestry cooperative that helps everybody, and again floats many boats by providing them what do they need, what do the people need in this market in order to survive, to help us get to the, you know, improving the forest health and economic possibilities and social possibilities. Let's give them the tools, and that's people, knowledge, and technology and resource.
Yeah, because there's many aspects that I just want to, I'd like to open up to the audience. I'd like to say, we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to just ask the people who are here, including you, Gary and Laura, and other people who maybe have been thinking about this for a while. What do you think is viable for Salt Spring around these ideas that are coming up? And then also we should keep in mind that not just the issue of private lands and maybe access to forest, I don't know the language, Mark, but to have a license to be registered for logging. But what is it that you think could work? So I'll just open that up to the audience. And I'm not, it's hard, wow, lots of things are coming in. So if someone can help me manage the chat, that would be great. And then the point that I want to raise too is one that I saw from Pierre Minot, raising the issue of, and also some discussion around the carbon ton price. So that could be another source of revenue. Transition Salt Spring is going after a project with the Kusanich to look into this and what value would work. And Mark, you said that $80 would be a start and 160 would actually be really good as a price per ton. But then Pierre is raising this issue of what you call strip and flip, that, you know, a lot of the land clearing that we have in Salt Spring is really not people interested in sustainable forestry, but it has to do with development pressures. And so I just really like to hear from anybody on this. And yes, so I'll open it up to whoever might want to speak to this, including members of the audience now.
Feel free to just unmute yourselves, folks, and chime in if you've got some thoughts here.
And while they're doing that, I'll just add quickly, though, the natural asset management too, which is a huge thing. So valuing, you know, wetlands and these forests and the carbon and the ecological goods and services they provide, so that there's some of the valuation that we can help figure out about bottom lines for the community forest as well too. And that's a coming angle as well too. The municipal natural asset initiative, where in our bookkeeping we can show that if we, you know, in a forestry operation on Cortes or anywhere, that we've retained these wetlands, which are storing carbon, filtering water, keeping water cool, then there's an actual monetary value to that. And that goes kind of to Pierre's point about the carbon per ton prices too. So that's an avenue that needs to be pursued as well. And everybody else go.
It's John Milson here. I've put it in the chat box there, but I think there's a lot of great material been thrown out this evening. But I think it needs to be put into kind of scalable groups. These are different activities for different groups of people. So maybe it's individuals, people like myself with a home, small landowners, the scale that Michael's operating on Seven Ravens there, and then the larger scale community initiatives. I think we need to break these out into different groups so we can deal with them, because otherwise we're overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed by some of the amazing material that's come out. But if we do that, I think then we can start to address it and target it at those different groups. You know, so what is it the individuals do? Susan asked about berms and how we can do that. You know, and berms and permaculture, that's a classic homeowners and Seven Ravens kind of scale activity. And what would we do to go down the road for a larger scale community group like Mark has got there? I mean, I really think there's some value in trying to do that, not in this meeting, but as a follow-on from this.
Can I add something?
Please.
I was thinking with that question, we're trying to educate our young people about climate change, and there's quite a number of kids in the schools here, and it would be a wonderful activity for us to take the school children and their parents out, you know, a couple of days a year to do some kind of forest management on some land somewhere, whether it's private or government or trust land or whatever it is, just so that people can understand this. Because the more that you expose people to it, then they're excited about it, then they take those practices home, and then they want to practice it on their own land, and then you slowly get the ball rolling.
Yeah, and the kids get it. Like the younger kids, before they get, you know, schooled, let's say, the young kids, they understand all of this, and then as they get up through the higher grades, the middle schools and the high schools, they lose. The system has driven that their innate understanding of nature and understanding how it all spins. Like you can ask kindergartners how this all works, and they got it. And we need to definitely build on that and show the kids the ecosystems in the 4 seasons and do forestry and do all and ecological restoration, all the above, that it will just help them and drive them and their parents and grandparents. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So that goes back to you, Mitchell. This sounds like the education. What I'm hearing is that this is really a community-based thing, and there's a lot of different roles. And so Mitchell, can you share a little bit about what you were thinking about in terms of the education work that the Fire and Rescue is getting the ball rolling on, or maybe what's missing and what others could step up for? Oh, Mitchell was there.
Yes, okay, I fixed the mute. So I mentioned the Fire Smart stuff about focusing on your personal home. There's also work that people can do with their neighbors, working on their neighborhoods. And there's been some really neat projects with that, where people have done things like broom clearing and then renting a chipper together. And it's fabulous. And we've even had a couple of communities become recognized as Fire Smart communities. But in addition to those things, and more in keeping with the kind of conversation we're having here, there's things we can look at of sort of changing how we govern our island forests. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens with the Island Trust regarding the coastal Douglas fir ecosystem. And I know that the technical committee's working on that right now, trying to come up with, okay, what do we do about this? And I think looking at land use in forests is a really big piece of the puzzle. And then another area that I'm interested in an educational component, is having perhaps a permanent area for when people move into forests, that they recognize that there's a responsibility that comes with stewarding a forest land. And that your actions there, what you plant, what you remove, what you add, could benefit or harm the forest health. So I'm seeking over the next few years to hopefully lobby for kind of a community wildland or wildfire development permit, where people are educated about the responsibilities that come with living in a forest. And then you asked me earlier about the community wildfire resilience plan. So I applied for and we received some funding to get this new planning document that will help guide us with community recommendations for about how to take care of our forests. And that would work for private homeowners, for developers and contractors. And hopefully if we are able to create something like a community forest, or our First Nations partners are able to do that, it would help guide them in some safe and healthy practices for managing those forests as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's great. So I think Darlene hasn't given me the notice yet, but I suspect that we're running low on time here. I just wanted to ask the panelists if there's anything you would like to share, like in terms of a next step. Maybe let's do a round. In terms of a next step, what do you think makes sense? So Michael, could I start with you? Just anything at all.
The next steps, I think when Erik started, he said something that was very, very important. He said, we have to figure out a way to work the system that is non-punitive. Because as soon as you put the punitive into it, what's going to happen is a lot of people, as we're seeing on Salt Spring now, because we've been hearing lots of changes are coming down the pipeline with the coastal Douglas fir forest, that people are clear cutting like crazy because they want to get the logs out of there, because then when they have no forest, then they've got no more issues and nobody can punish them. And so it's all about education, and it's about making it a fun thing. You know, if like when kids come here, like Erik was saying before, kindergarten kids, they get it, you know, and I love having 5-year-olds come into my forest and plant trees with me, because they're so excited about the whole thing and they love it. And I think the more people that can go into the forest with workshops to learn how to, you know, thin a forest, how to add value to the forest, how to reduce the fire risk by pruning, by limbing, by taking a few trees out, then maybe taking one log out in the process that might be a log that's had its top knocked off, and then making something out of it, having a sawmill there and actually slicing it up and making a whole bunch of breadboards, or that everyone can walk away with something that they've actually experienced this phenomenal day where they've all learned about ecology and responsibility and reduction of fire risk and stuff like that. It's all about education. And
yes.
The more we can have workshops open to the public, where it's a fun engagement, where we actually bring in the loggers,
yeah,
and let them show us their skills, let them be part of it, because once we say it's us and them, then it's all over.
No,
and,
I think Michael,
so
I'm sorry that I have to wrap us up because Darlene is pointing, but I think I love that as an ending. I'm seeing Erik, and I know Mark is also nodding his head, and Mitchell, that you've summed that up, I think, the conversation very well. And so what I'd like to do is just thank all of you very much. And I also to say that I very much see this as a first in a conversation about forest solutions for Salt Spring, and not as the event being this discussion being done is